All right, we're live. Another episode of Monero Talk. Uh, doing Monero coffee chat with the original Monero coffee chat. Oh, you're not even doing coffee today?
No, I just have water today.
You don't want to ruin your brand.
I think I've only had coffee for a third of the coffee chats. And
Okay.
I think collectively among every one of the participants, it's probably only about a half or two-thirds of the time even.
Yeah, I like to do these during the week just because I work during the week and then I just kind of do them like to do them right after work. With the Globy one, we had to do in the morning only because of being on the other side of the world. But I see you're kind of only available on the weekends. Because are you still a student?
Yes, I'm a full-time student. I'm at the University of Minnesota. I'm doing finance and management information systems, so I still have that going on most days of the week. But I still like to contribute to Monero. I've done it for several years, and I still want to continue finding ways to get more and more involved here.
Yeah, because I mean the amount of time you dedicate is tremendous, right? I'm seeing I see you all over Reddit, all over Twitter, doing these videos every now and then, and I can only imagine what you're doing behind the scenes, and then I guess traveling as well. It seems like you're dedicating quite a bit of time.
Yeah, this between the work I do with Monero and the work I do with my student group on campus, I have a cryptocurrency club student group, on campus. It takes up a lot of time, but since I enjoy it so much, it doesn't really bother me. I'm the type of person that really likes to be busy. I'd much rather be running around trying to juggle all these things than to feel bored at any point. So for me, it's a great challenge. I really enjoy it. And I would not enjoy it so much if I didn't think Monero was a great project to contribute to, and I didn't think that there were important aspects to contribute to in the cryptocurrency ecosystem. But I think it's highly important. I'm highly interested in it, which makes it a lot easier. It makes it so much easier for me to dedicate the time I have toward making these communities better.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't even properly introduce you. So Justin, how do you pronounce the last name?
Justin Ehrenhofer.
Ehrenhofer, and also known as Samsung Galaxy Player. Has that been a name following you around pre-Monero, or was that your what it started as your originally anonymous Monero handle?
It just started off as my high school Reddit handle.
Okay.
I didn't have a smartphone at the time. I just had like an Android equivalent of an iPod Touch that were really popular back then. And the name of the device was a Samsung Galaxy Player. And I was super uninteresting and just named my Reddit account the name of the device I was using at the time. And I tried to get away from it slightly. You'll see if I'm on IRC, it's SGP to sort of shorten it, to break an affiliation with Samsung, since I'm not really sponsored by Samsung in any way and don't knowingly use any of their products. But it has stayed with me a little bit. At this point, I don't think it's worth changing, but that's sort of the way that I got that nickname in the first place. And as I started to become part of the Manero Reddit community and got more involved, I carried the name over, and it sort of just stuck that way.
Were you using Reddit pre-crypto, or was because for me that was kind of my first use of Reddit. I mean, I had known about Reddit, but I never really like went on there. And then it was when I first started to like try to learn about Bitcoin and crypto. That was like the go-to place. In fact, even that was a little bit of a learning curve. I don't think people even realize that to go from non-Reddit world to Reddit world. That was even a little bit of a like, oh, it's a new thing. Were you on Reddit before crypto?
Yeah, I was. It was a good way to spend downtime in class in high school. I mean, that's really what the original motivating factor was.
Is that how you got into crypto, or was it elsewhere on the interwebs?
So I first discovered Bitcoin actually on the Colbert Report back when it was its own show on Comedy Central. And Colbert was joking about how this online asset with nothing back it has any value and perhaps could be volatile, and was making.
What was that? That was like 2012 or something, 13.
It was probably 2013, 2014.
Okay.
I could look, it was if you want to look up the interview, it was Colbert specifically interviewing someone from NPR, speaking about why this has any value and or could have any value, and that was the first time I really remember hearing about it at all. And I had already spent some time, mostly through boredom in high school, messing with like Tor and I2P just to figure out how they worked. I even messed a little bit with Freenet, just trying to understand how they worked. So I came from, I don't want to say a significant background because I was a high school student that didn't know what I was doing, but I came from a background of already at least knowing what these were and an intrigue of trying to understand how they worked. And I carried that over to Bitcoin. I started messing around a little bit, learning about how it worked. I remember I initially downloaded and synced a node, mined for about a week, didn't earn anything because I was just using my laptop. And then I think promptly uninstalled it for at least a long period of time after that. But when I started getting more interested in the technology, it definitely helped having some previous, at least some exposure to Tor and I2P, because it really helped me understand that Bitcoin didn't fulfill a lot of the privacy guarantees that it was, or at least that were portrayed in the media. And I was like, there has to be someone that also acknowledges this problem, and there have to be some people looking at technologies to try and mitigate these concerns. And so I was hopping around on Stack Exchange, basically looking for questions and comments about these different technologies available. I ran into Dash first. I was learning about the sort of coin join system that they have. And it was actually a comment from Andrew Polstra on one of the on some random Stack Exchange post somewhere. He answered and went into detail about what ring signatures were, which then ultimately led me into Monero. And I found it interesting enough that I wanted to continue learning about it, and it sort of spiraled out of control from there. So it was an initial, I want to learn how it worked. And then other people had questions about how it worked, and I want to be like, I want to help answer your questions. And
you think he's the guy behind the essentially the Manero white paper, the crypto note?
Who Andrew yeah, Andrew Polstra is Nicholas von Saberhagen.
Gotta be somebody. No, is that ridiculous? I don't know. Well, he's kind of like the leading the leading mathematician in that field, right? Of a lot of these privacy.
Yeah, he has done a lot to contribute towards privacy technologies in distributed systems, and continues to provide research. I recently watched one of his talks on Mimblewimble. So he's not designing Grin, from my understanding, but he's pushing the Mimblewimble technology forward, and is a major contributor in those technologies. So yeah, he's still a very active player in this space. If there was someone that would have the expertise, and hopefully Grin doesn't go in the same way as Bytecoin, I guess, from that perspective, but someone would perhaps have the expertise to carry that out.
Okay.
If you want to make speculations on the show,
yeah,
there could be worse ones. But
So did you kind of have this natural or not, I don't want to say, was your inclination towards protecting privacy, and did you have these like philosophical beliefs before you found Monero and crypto, or was it that you discovered Bitcoin, you were looking at it and you're like, it's not as anonymous as it claims to be, and that's just kind of an issue with what this technology should be? Or is it that you actually are a supporter of these kind of libertarian views and pro-privacy, things like that. Like how did you, what gets you excited about Monero? Is it really that it's just like kind of checking off a technical box that we need fungibility in crypto, or is there more to it, and you're kind of interested in like the philosophical and political aspects of it as well, like the repercussions that come with creating a distributed currency that can't be censored?
I think it's a little bit less from the political side generally. To be pretty honest, I'm generally pretty liberal. I'm, at least in the U.S., I support pretty strongly liberal policies. But
so what was your interest in things like Tor then? It was just because the technology was interesting, or?
I think that was the initial spark, is that we had this really cool tools that people could use. I think that they provide a strong opportunity for people to do good. I mean, of course, there's an opportunity for people to do negative things, but I think generally those are outweighed. And since this is a technology, it's not like we can hand wave it away. It'll always be there. There will be someone that's contributing to these. And I love John Oliver's episode on encryption, for example, where he's like, you can't really just outlaw encryption. If you outlaw encryption, then like to avoid all the regulations you have, someone needs to download just Signal or the Wire or whatever they're using in order to use this math. It's hard to prohibit someone from using math. Mm-hmm. And I think that cryptocurrencies really are a fascinating way where, like, I generally have faith in the Fed in the United States. We have a very stable system, maybe not as much recently, but generally we have a stable system as far as countries go. And I think that even if there isn't a lot of significant utility, especially in highly developed countries where they generally trust the central banks and the issuers of currency, that cryptocurrencies are still fascinating. They're still interesting. And there are many benefits that a essentially fully digital cash implementation could provide. And I think one of the really important traits that would have is fungibility. So I'm generally a really strong supporter of fungibility. I think that even if some people possess the technical capability to try and take on the role of auditing the funds they receive, I think that ultimately the people that lose out in this system where it's not fungible are the everyday people who transact. It's not going to be the banks that lose out. It's going to be the individual people who unknowingly accept bad funds. Mm-hmm. And so I think privacy is really important from that perspective. And I just thought the technology is fascinating. Our ability to just have a system where the operators of the infrastructure of the system are able to contribute to it, collectively control it without any outside party having a significant ability to have, or an ability to have a significant impact over the system. And I just wanted to be a part of it because I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, you mentioned in one of your tweets, fungibility is determined by the lowest common denominator of privacy. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so when people talk about fungibility, this is something I'm really passionate about generally. But when people talk about fungibility, they normally come about it from the perspective that, like, I have tainted funds and I want to spend them. How do I fix a situation where I have tainted funds? Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily the sort of right perspective, where we shouldn't be asking, we shouldn't be worrying as much, or the conversation should not be focused on someone worrying about the ability for them to spend funds. The conversation should be someone, it's similar, but instead it should be someone accepting funds that they cannot spend. So if you are a merchant that is receiving funds, if you are in a fungible system, you should have no regard for the funds you're accepting. You should be able to accept Manero or whatever token you're describing without looking up the previous history, without worrying about it being tainted. if you have a subset of your project that uses a privacy system and a more transparent system, perhaps you might exclude the tokens that are in this private system for the sake that they are more likely to have come from a tainted past, or you might not accept the public tokens because you're worried about them potentially having some taint to them. So it's almost like an additional level, because if you receive token, if you have optional privacy in a system, sure, you could potentially receive tainted coins and try and clean them later, but you still have a public association between you and those tokens that's recorded forever. So you still, even if you have the ability to potentially wash tokens in the future, you still have this association that you do not want to have, and therefore really isn't fungible, because you need to worry about these potential associations. So in my opinion, there are ways to make things fungible in practice. I sort of have like fungible as one extreme. It's, in my opinion, a spectrum, and nothing will ever be perfectly fungible. Monero isn't perfectly fungible, but it's pretty close, and in my opinion, it's fungible in practice. Another way, and so privacy is one way to make something fungible in practice, where you're unable to discern what the history of these coins are. Another way that it might be fungible in practice, not in every circumstance, but enough that people don't really need to worry that much, is if large governments passed a law saying that you are not liable at all for the funds you received. That would really go a long way, because a merchant could still, from a political perspective or whatever it might be, try and avoid using these private tokens. But I think that's at least generally less significant than at least the current status quo, where regulatory environments are pressuring recipients of funds to go the other way, where they want exchanges to assess the history of funds to see if they are tainted, to meet KYC and AML requirements. So I think that's government intervention is one way that actually could help fungibility, even on a relatively not private asset. But I think privacy is one of the best ways to guarantee a level of fungibility, where you can have fungibility despite a potentially adversarial government environment. So I think that there's value that Manero brings to the table there, because you have a system that is fungible in practice without regard to everything else that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, leaving it up to the regulators and government seems doesn't really seem like what crypto was built for, right? That's not like really what the crypto anarchists were about. I think, right, it's more about having the technology and having the math determine it, so that we're not relying on society to make that determination. Because it may be fungible one day, and then the next day they may decide that it's not fungible, right?
Yeah, they could theoretically all of a sudden start imposing these rules on people. And you've sort of seen that with Bitcoin, really, where people didn't care, and then some people started to care, and then more and more people cared even more.
Right.
So,
but like Sweden could say, hey, from now on, one Bitcoin always equals one Bitcoin in Sweden, no matter what.
Yeah, and then you would have a bunch of tainted coins being run through Sweden, right?
for the whole world to get on board, and for all the governments of the world to be like, one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin, it's not going to happen. And I mean, I don't see how that would ever possibly happen. So I guess the thought is this stuff needs to be baked into the technology itself, similar to the way an atom of gold equals an atom of gold. Right? You're not relying on government to tell you that. It's just built into it. It's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, we have the ability to not care about this, right? We have the ability to make mathematical systems that can create fungibility regardless of the environment. And so I think that there's value in having that sort of system in place.
Yeah. So yeah, why is fungibility then such a critical element of this versus Bitcoin, where they seem to care less about it. Why do you think it's such a fundamental element to what crypto needs to be?
Well, I don't even think it's just something that crypto needs to be. I think it's just something that any mechanism of exchange needs to have, where I'm highly concerned. Like, I don't know if I often don't even accept Bitcoin payments because I know that in the moment I can't audit the source of funds I'm receiving, right? And so that it's really worrying. It's kind of odd that if someone on the street was like, "I'll just give you a free Bitcoin," you might be obligated to say no, right? Because you might be worried about the potential previous history of that coin, and even if you're getting value, you might get your like Coinbase account shut down because you accepted some free Bitcoin or something. And I think that's ridiculous. So I think from a practical standpoint, you really need fungibility in a system in order for people to use money in the way they assume it's used, right? I think that the idea of assets not being fungible is kind of news to everyone because we've grown up using cash, even using credit card and digital payments. We didn't really care, right? We can just use money because it was fungible. And the ability for it not to be fungible, or if you have a situation like you have with Bitcoin where it's not fungible, people need to relearn what it's like not to have fungible money. And since it's all digital and it's able for everyone to assess across the entire world, you don't really have an escape where people just didn't know or weren't exposed to it or didn't have the ability to check. Instead, this information is readily available and there's pressure for people to use it. So people are. And I think that over time, this situation will keep getting worse and worse. It's sort of the realization that people generally have with Facebook, though, or had with Facebook, is that there are a lot of warning signs that they were collecting a lot of information about users and generally don't care about the privacy of most of its users. And many enthusiasts essentially privacy enthusiasts, were complaining about this for years, but it took revelations about the election and the potential impact they had on the U.S. election in order to get people to realize that, oh, wow, this is a consequence of using these systems. And it might take another big moment like that with Bitcoin's fungibility for people to understand. It might take a really high profile case for people to really have to connect with, for people to really understand it, or else, like, people don't get upset about the fungibility of Bitcoin unless their Coinbase account has been closed, or unless they receive ransomware payments, or they go to make a local Bitcoins trade and receive tainted coins. Right. And even some of these things are pretty niche. Not that many people are making local Bitcoins trades compared to the people buying it on regulated exchanges. So I think it will take a big moment for people to really realize it. My hope is that we don't even need to get to that point. Hopefully people can use fungible systems to begin with and not have to worry about it. People shouldn't have to worry about the specific technology that Monero is using or the fact that it's fungible. They should be able to use money the way they assume it works. And one of those assumptions is fungibility. But if it's not met in practice, I think it'll take people some time to realize that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if Bitcoin's good enough, then they'll just use it without realizing what it's lacking. Did you read that? I think I even posted it in our Telegram that it's an old article from a few months ago that Michael Casey wrote. Did you? Where he basically said it's called "Privacy is Vital to Crypto and the Global Economy."
Yeah, the CoinDesk article.
Yeah, I just think that he really boils it down well in explaining at its crux the importance of fungibility, and he basically arrives at fungibility essentially being a matter of free speech, because he defines money as a communication system, right? It's just a way to communicate by transferring value, right? Mm-hmm. So it's similar to a language except, you know, in this case, you're transferring value through this communication system. So the only way for that to work efficiently is if every unit equals every other unit. And I mean, that's kind of the way I like to look at it in its simplest form. But what do you think of that kind of that free speech argument?
That, you know, honestly, that's a pretty tough question because
that's really what kind of what excites, what I would say excites me the most about fungibility in Monero, because I really do think that's what it boils down to.
So personally, so I have generally mixed opinions. And I think most of it results from US politics in general, that it's something I generally have to reconcile with, is that we're building a system that allows people to transfer funds with a high level of privacy, a high level of fungibility. And at the same time, generally in politics, I have some concerns over how some players are essentially taking advantage of the system in politics. So I hesitate to say that money is free speech. I think that these privacy systems are important in money, but it's not. Yeah, I generally come about the importance of privacy and fungibility from a different perspective. And I think that generally comes from different political beliefs that I generally have. But I can understand why. I understand the logic behind that perspective that you shared in the article. And like, even if I don't fully agree with it.
Okay. Let's see. Let's jump. You mind if we jump around a little bit?
Sounds good.
So how did you? We didn't really talk about how did you actually start to establish your role in the community, and how would you actually define your current role? I mean, I know it's an open source community. Everybody just kind of labeling themselves. You're certainly vitally important at this point. It seems like you seem to really have established yourself as a real connector and a leader. You're helping pushing projects along. You really help get the word out on explaining the technology to, I guess you could say, the masses. But what would you define your role as in the Monero community?
So my self-imposed role that I usually say Manero Community Work Group Organizer is usually the title that I defer to. In early 2017, I was studying abroad in Austria. I was out of Vienna. And as you generally have in study abroad programs, you have a lot of time to go and travel. A lot of the experience is getting out, viewing different perspectives, viewing new things. And so you are a full-time student, but the expectation is not that you're spending the entire time in class and studying. The expectation is that you're learning other lessons by getting out and learning about different cultures and perspectives. So I had a lot of additional free time outside of class that I normally don't have, at least to the same extent here in the US. So I had a lot of time to get more involved in the Manero project. And I sort of weighed my options. I am not a highly technical coder. And so I weighed the option of learning how to code to be able to directly contribute to Manero. And I still want to become more technical over time. But I realized, not that it would be bad for me to learn to code, of course, but I realized that if I spent the entire summer doing nothing but learning how to code, I would be the worst contributor to the Monero ecosystem, right? Whereas some of these people have been coding for decades, understand cryptography on top of the coding that they're touched. They really implement these highly specific and highly specialized systems and highly specific code. So I would be the newest of the new person after all my time dedicated to that perspective. And so I pondered for some time, and I decided that instead I wanted to spend most of my time going out and talking about Monero and privacy systems. So I use the form funding system requests. I use the free time I had on weekends to go out, travel to different parts of Europe, and communicate with other local communities about Monero and about the importance of privacy and fungibility, making sure that they understood it. And at the time, I was one of 2 or 3 people that were really talking about Monero at the time. I had taken a lot of inspiration from the speeches Ricardo, Fluffy Pony, had done at previous conferences and previous meetups. And I even asked him for a copy of the slides so I can base my initial information off what he had and sort of have adapted that over time. But it was a really good way for me to get more involved, to force me to better understand the mechanics of how Monero worked, and to be able to communicate them to people in a way that they would understand. And it was really the best way that I could have a meaningful impact in the Monero project. That it was the largest impact I could reasonably offer. So I started getting involved there by speaking with people about it. Then early 2017, after I had already given a few talks, the Monero link paper came out. This was a paper that had analyzed the traceability of Monero up to the implementation of Ring CT. And the community was generally disgruntled with how it was released. It literally was released the day of one of the hard forks that was going on in the Monero ecosystem. And so we worked together. I helped lead an effort to author a response to these authors to discuss some of the concerns that we generally had with the paper and some of the recommendations that we had going forward. So that really helped me get more involved in understanding ring signatures, because that's what the majority of what the paper was about, were these ring signatures. Mm-hmm. So that was my initial dive into the sort of, I'm taking more assertions here. I'm putting my name next to some descriptions of Monero's privacy, its impacts, and its ring signatures specifically. And I wrote a follow-up to that paper early in 2018 about like the second iteration of the paper. That's on the Get Monero website also. And I think it's generally a very good response. The authors of the paper mentioned that they were generally very pleased with the response that I wrote for them. And I'm actually I just realized this a few days ago, that I'm actually mentioned in the first paragraph of the acknowledgments of the paper. So I'm very pleased that has resulted the way it did. But that was just my involvement, sort of getting a little bit more involved in the research ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And then finally, another huge push to really understand it was, again, early in this year, or early 2018, when Monero V, which is an airdrop on Monero, announced that they were doing a Monero announced that their existence and their intent to fork Monero. And although we had heard of other airdrops that other coins were had, and that they were kind of all the rage back during that time, in the wave of Bitcoin Cash, at least holding value over time. So that allowed people to easily pump, split, and dump. And so we should have seen that trend coming. I just never associated it with Monero. And so we kind of had to scramble there and understanding the implications of this. I ended up making a video, which at the time was the best comprehensive resource we had, about what the potential impacts to Monero that chains will have. And I didn't get it fully right. I was a little off on some of the time windows, for instance. But in general, it was a good collection of information. And then I used the information I had learned to argue for Monero to change the ring size that it had going into that network protocol upgrade in order to provide better protections against these potential attacks that were new to us. I don't know of anyone that had thought of this sort of attack before, and luckily we were able to comprehend it before the first chain split happened, which actually wasn't Monero V. The bigger impact was Monero split did its normal upgrade to version 7, and the ASIC stayed on version 6, and you had like Monero Original, Monero Classic, all those things. Mm-hmm. So we will probably still experience similar splits in the future. And it's important to recognize these aren't community splits necessarily. It's just someone, hey, I don't have to, all I need to do to make my own coin is not upgrade my software. Someone's going to do it. So we need to understand the impact of these. And I think that we generally feel very comfortable with the situation we're in, even now, and especially after this next protocol upgrade next month, when I really think we can put this concern mostly behind us, even if there is a large contentious community split. I think our privacy should generally be okay. So we've really come a long way there.
So what come a long way in what? In terms of understanding it, or actions we've taken to kind of nullify it?
So really both. So the first step was understanding it, and then the second aspect was actually making the tools to mitigate these concerns. So once we understood what the major concerns were, we updated wallet software so that even if you're using a fork and have no idea of the potential privacy ramifications of what you're doing or consequences, it will purposefully generate transactions so that you don't contribute to either networks, or at least don't directly contribute to either network's degradation of privacy. And we have increased the ring size, which we basically expanded the built-in buffer that we have in Monero to protect against these scenarios. So there needs to be a significantly greater adversarial scenario for it to have any meaningful impact on the network. And we also developed blackball tools, which I know you wanted to talk about today. Those just help users avoid known bad funds, and the ability just to have these tools is important, especially for really small ring sizes. So we're mostly past the need for it now, but it still could have some benefits in highly adversarial environments, or if a pool or something is trying to attack the network, that you would, there's a built-in additional privacy feature you can use there to better protect yourself. So
that's something, when you say that's something that's like, how do you even go about using that tool?
So it's changing a little bit for the for this protocol upgrade, because the wallet software and the structure is being upgraded to a more efficient, lean process. But on moneroblackball.com, I outline the general steps you need to take in order to run this blackball tool. And you need to essentially scan the database that you have locally, the blockchain database, and create a new database with a list of bad outputs, and then scan through them again and again until you have a list. And then with the current situation, it basically just exports a text file with one output per line. And then you can import this in your wallet. Your wallet software will purposely avoid using these outputs that are listed. The actual structure of those files is changing slightly to be more efficient, but that's generally the same process that will occur. You will search the Monero blockchain and compare it against other blockchain databases, compare it against public pool data, and look to see where any ring signatures are compromised. And if they are, comparing those outputs against other ring signatures to see if there were any chain reactions that occurred. Because if I have a ring signature and all of my decoys, all the other outputs I selected are known to be false, they're known to be spent in other transactions, to the point where all these other decoys are known false, so mine is known to be the real one, then you should also exclude the real one that I spent, because you know it's spent in that transaction. So that's the concept of a chain reaction, that you have a ring signature, but the ring signature is void, essentially. It's useless. So that's the blackball tool helps protect against those scenarios. If Monero has a really large ring size, the blackball tool, although it's always useful, it just might not be significant or meaningful. And as we get to ring sizes larger than 10, like we will next month, we need to worry less and less about these tools. This was really a major concern with Monero's ring size being 3, 5, maybe 7 under chain split circumstances. But with 11, I'm confident that under really any scenario that we can anticipate, even a combination of scenarios, that Monero's ring signature's built-in buffer is large enough that most people probably don't need to even worry about using this tool. Because even if 3 of their ring members are compromised, I mean, they still have 7 others. So they need to worry less and less as time progresses.
Yeah, I mean, ring signatures seems to really be where like the rubber hits the road with Monero, right? I mean, it's kind of where we're getting most of our privacy, and then it's also where we have to really figure out how we scale, right? Isn't that kind of our, if anything's preventing easy scaling, would you say it's kind of the ring signature component of Monero? Is that fair to say?
So it's hard to say that it's the only thing that we're worried about, but it definitely imposes a real trade-off we need to make, specifically between the privacy offered by ring signatures and the verification time that we have in ring signatures. We're less concerned now, luckily, about the size that these take up, but they still are pretty cumbersome to verify. And as a result, we really need to make a trade-off between the privacy that's offered to verify that against real use cases and real threat models. And then we also need to weigh this against the us potentially making the system less accessible. So luckily we had like a really shining moment with bulletproofs where everything got better. So we were able to get more flexibility there, and we are taking advantage of it in order to provide better privacy. But suppose we wanted to do something truly crazy, like raise Monero's ring size to 1,000 for every transaction. That, and from a privacy perspective, 1,000 is better than 10, right? But you need to quantify, okay, under what circumstances does that actually matter, right? Does it matter? And number 2, by increasing this ring size, are you actually hurting your privacy by making it so that most people aren't using Monero anymore because it's too cost prohibitive? Or it takes too long for them to download a blockchain now, so you have fewer people running full nodes, the network is more centralized, people generally rely more on these remote nodes and therefore compromise more of their privacy that way. So not to say that you compromise a significant amount of privacy, but if everyone used a more centralized model, then we're making real sacrifices for the network. So these are real trade-offs we generally have to make. Ring signatures are the best technology that we have available, given, and to echo what Sarang was saying when he was on your show, I believe last week, they provide the best, they provide a high level of privacy under the scenarios that we feel comfortable with, where within Manero, we don't want to have a trusted solution. We don't want, and we want it to be verifiable. So they really are good at doing what they say they're doing. It's, and I think reasonably under most use cases, people don't need to worry that much either. We're sort of, a lot of work in Manero Research Lab recently has been determining heuristics possible in order to test against different scenarios. So saying, okay, well, I can't prove you did something, but something generally looks suspicious. So that might be problematic for a KYC AML exchange who might hold your funds for a certain period of time or require further verification or something. And that's a lot of work has generally gone there, and we still have a lot of work to do. But I think ring signatures are generally at a really good state, and there's always the possibility for sidechain solutions. There are so many different solutions Monero can choose from in order to improve its privacy. I'm generally not concerned, and I think it's far more important to have a base system where there's there's certain guarantees of privacy on the base system, so that as you're interfacing with these other systems, you do not need to worry as much about metadata leakage. And I think that'll be a big thing going forward, where
yeah, what'd you think of Jimmy Song's tweet? Where he basically said, you know what, we don't even really need, I don't even know if we want privacy and fungibility on the core protocol level of Bitcoin.
So that's interesting. So I think that generally optional privacy has generally been shown to be a pretty bad idea. I think if you generally...
What'd you think of his reasoning, though? Like, he's basically saying, you know, then you can't audit the chain to know, you know, how many coins are in existence.
Yeah, so I think I definitely understand the arguments there, and I definitely, like, in Bitcoin's case, I generally buy it. I think that for Bitcoin, it would be very contentious, and I don't think it would necessarily even be the best for Bitcoin to move to a system where I don't want to say it's impossible to audit, but it's more difficult to audit. For example, with Monero, it is auditable, but it's more difficult to audit.
It requires more trust in math, but
well, not necessarily that it requires more trust in math, but you need to know what you're testing against. For Bitcoin's case, it's pretty simple. Like, if I double spent on Bitcoin right now, right, and was successful with it somehow broke the protocol to somehow double spend, how would you immediately learn about it?
I don't know. I guess if people are analyzing the blockchain, I mean, I don't really.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly. You're not just going to get like a big warning notification on your phone that is initiated by you. You might get someone who is investigating the blockchain, notice there is a discrepancy, and then warn people about it. In a similar way, it works like that with Monero, where the problem is you often don't know what to test for. So like in the past, there was a major flaw in Monero's key images for ring CT, and we didn't know where the flaw when it was originally implemented in the protocol. But once the flaw was found and understood, we were still able to run a test to determine if it was exploited. So it's a similar mechanism in Manero where, like, just running a node isn't necessarily going to tell you of something if there is a flaw that is like a severe flaw. Instead, you're going to have to test it against something. And with Monero, you can still at least do that. You can run a test to make sure that money wasn't generated out of thin air. Like we saw with Litecoin, for instance, people were reusing coins or were manipulating these ring CT key images in a way that allowed them to double, triple, quadruple spend. So you could still test for that behavior. So I think that's generally an important distinction, is that, but the issue is that sometimes it's in retrospect, right? Is that you can test in retrospect, but it's harder to test as things are happening in the moment. You need to understand the vulnerability better. So I think there absolutely is value out of a system that is really easy to audit, that is really easy to test for. But I don't think that, I think generally people far overlook the metadata leakage that happens when you have a lot of association between a private or transparent system. I think that the ability to settle against a system where you don't have leaked metadata is going to be highly valuable. If people want to make Lightning Network transactions for their efficiency, there will be a high value of settling against a coin where the transaction amount is hidden. Because you don't need to worry about the leaked metadata there. Like, for example, Zcash. Not that I want to use them necessarily as a terrible example, but their transparent and private example or systems leads for a significant amount of leaked metadata. So they have, better privacy than Monero within the fully private system within a fully shielded transaction. But as people interface with this shielded pool, they leak a lot of data. And they were able to attribute 69% of the funds that touched this shielded pool to specific addresses on the transparent blockchain based off the leaked metadata. So it's sort of interesting how you have what would otherwise be like a perfectly private system, right? You have a system where you don't know anything about the funds being transacted within the system, but the second you interface with it in a different way, all hell breaks loose, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that as you build solutions on top of projects, the real value will come from those small attack surface. Monero really shines because it has a very narrow attack surface. You do not, I mean, sure, ring signatures aren't perfect, but they still provide a lot of protection. And you don't need to worry about transactions amounts being visible. You don't need to worry about addresses appearing on the blockchain. Those are all general guarantees that you have, and it really narrows the amount of information you can learn about a user compared to the information you can try and find on a transparent Bitcoin-based system or Ethereum-based system or whatever it might be. So there definitely are values out of transparent systems, but for the goals that we're trying to achieve, and it might be that we're just trying to achieve different goals, and I think that's fine. I think there's definitely room for, I think there's a lot of need for there to be a system that is itself, like on the full chain itself, protective against many of these metadata leaks. I think that will provide a significant value to sidechain solutions that are built in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, it feels slightly disingenuous when the Bitcoin maximalists are now starting to say, well, we may not even want privacy on the core protocol. I just think that's a real stretch to start to say that they may not even want it for those reasons we're talking about. And now I guess the argument being, well, we'll take care of it on the second layer. But I mean, what do you think about that? Lightning as a second layer on Bitcoin. I know this is like the question that everybody's trying to figure out. Will that make Bitcoin more fungible? Will it make it more private? Like you said, you're settling back onto a transparent ledger. You have those leaks. So, I mean, what is your overall feeling on that? Do you think Lightning on Bitcoin equals or supersedes Monero as is in terms of privacy and fungibility?
So I definitely think that Lightning will bring many benefits to Bitcoin. It's bringing additional efficiency. It's bringing additional privacy. It's bringing additional fungibility. But to equate that to the level of protection that Manero provides right now is generally false. And there are so many caveats involved, especially with general metadata leaked, that I hesitate to say that is a reasonable claim. I think that it certainly brings benefits over what the existing system is now, but they aren't the same level of general privacy guarantees. If you're using and I will say with the caveat, I'm not a Lightning expert. I'm not familiar with all the nuances of Lightning, so I'm not specifically going to speak to all of those today. But to say that a system that interfaces generally with a transparent system, essentially as a multi-sig time-locked setup, as you make these payment channels, sure, they provide better privacy than a direct on-chain link. But really, I don't think that's the same level of privacy that you would get out of Monero. I don't think that it's a really fair comparison. And if you say it's more fungible, then you're making the claim that generally, if you're a merchant, you're only accepting Lightning payments. You're not accepting Bitcoin on-chain payments. And I'm sure that there are some resonating effects that help on-chain, but ultimately, you're still out there to accept the lowest common denominator, right? Your lowest common denominator of privacy doesn't change on the system. So fungibility might be slightly improved, but it still isn't especially great. So to answer one of the questions from Vincent in the comments, who said, like, is Lightning compatible with Monero? Yes, Lightning can be built on top of Monero, and I think that putting Lightning on top of Monero will allow for these really easy, facilitated, inexpensive transfers of funds with slightly weaker security promises, right? You don't have a full on-chain transaction, but for your coffee, who cares, right? You can buy your coffee without having to worry about leaking any of the metadata to go back on chain. You can buy a coffee on your way to buy a house, right? Like,
could Lightning? Because I mean, another issue. You know, I obviously don't fully understand Lightning as well, and there seems to be a lot of that going around. I think there's only so many people that really are really getting this at this point, because it's on the leading edge of the tech. But the issue of Lightning on top of Bitcoin in terms of being sustainable, the way Bitcoin is architected in terms of the block reward eventually ending, right? Whereas in Manero, we have the tail emission. Because somebody had brought up a scenario on Twitter. So if Bitcoin is essentially everybody's porting over to the Lightning Network, right? Lightning Network works, everybody moves over, essentially starts transacting on the Lightning Network. There's not going to really be any transactions being made on the base blockchain of Bitcoin anymore, right? I mean, other than settling to the chain, but what's really what's going to be the driving incentive to do that? And then, so how is mining going to be sustainable when you don't really have transactions happening on the blockchain itself, and eventually the block reward disappears? So what are miners, if everybody's on Lightning Network, how is mining sustainable at that point? Which leads me to think, like, on Monero, I could all right, well, Monero, at least we have a tail emission, right?
Yeah, we have a tail emission. I highly recommend you speak to Arctic Mine, who is a Monero core team member, about this. This is his level of expertise specifically. He gave a talk at DEF CON about Monero's tail emission and Monero's block issuance and block size. Other relevant details, and I think he would find that very interesting in a way that is far better than the way I could potentially answer that.
Yeah, right, I mean, yeah, I don't know. It just struck me as obvious when I was like, wow, that does sound like a pretty big problem. I mean, granted, the block reward on Bitcoin is going to be around for some time, but if the goal is to move everybody over to the Lightning Network, where all transactions are going to be taking place, I'm starting to not understand where the security of the network is going to come from if there's little incentive to mine.
Yeah, I personally haven't really spent too much time on that perspective, but I would love to hear Arctic Mine's position on that. I think generally it is an extreme to say that no one will use the chain. Ideally, you'd have similar complementary solutions that would make the chain more efficient. And if no one's using it, then the fee to use the chain is essentially zero anyway. So I think that would mitigate the argument. But I don't have a exact solution for that. I'm not very familiar with.
So I mean, I'm going to continue to explore this question, obviously. But so Lightning Network on Manero obviously is something that is technically feasible. And then you also hear things like Mimblewimble as a side chain. What does that mean? And I mean, I know these are big questions, but is that like we would have Lightning Network on Monero, and then we'd also have Mimblewimble as a side chain, or is it there's going to be a one or the other type thing? We're trying to figure out which one is going to be the best option for scaling and maintaining privacy. But I'm hearing multiple kind of options here for our scaling future.
Yeah. So, I mean, I generally agree with Ricardo's statement here, where like if a new technology comes along and is available, you might as well support it, right? So Ultimately, though, will be restricted to, like, based off the developer resources we generally have. We'll have to prioritize what systems would provide the best advantages. But in an ideal situation, you would have Lightning, you would have Mimblewimble, you would have a ZK Snark sidechain, you'd have a ZK Stark sidechain, you'd have merge mine sidechains on the side like Tari. You would have so many different interfaces on top of Monero, so many different shared components on top of Monero. And there really is no, I think generally there are like very strong arguments for why you would want to support as many solutions as possible. I mean, there ultimately will be some that people gravitate more towards. If Lightning provides the benefits that most stakeholders in the ecosystem want, then Lightning will be more widely used. We might prioritize hiring researchers and developers for a Lightning solution, or maybe someone independent makes their own Lightning solution, or whatever it might be. Right? So Monero itself, on the protocol level, or at least the expectation from Manero on the protocol level, is to support as many of these solutions as possible, because we're still early enough that like there are pros and cons about both, but the dynamic of what's better under what circumstances will probably change over the next few years. So with Manero, we want it to be as flexible as possible generally. And if someone comes with a large motivated development team that wants to work on one of these side layer implementations, there shouldn't be no technical reason why they shouldn't be able to do that. Mm-hmm. It would not interface with Monero's consensus protocol level. If it takes a special wallet, so be it. Someone will make a special wallet. Well, perhaps if it's popular enough, it might be interfaced in the official wallets. So, yeah, just support everything, I guess. Do you have any reasons why you would not want to support all of these, I guess, except for just a limited number of developer resources?
No, absolutely not. I'm just trying to understand it from a technical perspective, as whether or not is it a choice that's going to be made by the community as what's the best way to go, or I personally wasn't even thinking of it in terms of there being all these multiple options. Obviously, if that makes technical sense, then sure. I guess there's advantages to kind of having everybody moving in one direction, right? So you have kind of more development happening on, in one area, more network effect. Kind of like, in Bitcoin land, everybody's this kind of mass agreement that Lightning Network is the next stage, and that's what they're working on, and that's how they're going to scale, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess we just haven't really reached those crossroads yet, as to getting to that next second layer. I mean, I know Tari is starting up. I guess that's kind of what's spearheading it. Is it fair to say?
Yeah, they're helping spearhead that movement for sure.
Okay, so yeah, I think we're just in an earlier stage, right, mm-hmm. than Bitcoin in terms of figuring out our scaling in second layers.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think part of that, or a very large part of that, comes from some of the limitations of Monero's protocol generally. We only recently added basic multisig. We're adding more advanced multisig. Those papers were finally recently published. So those technical requirements on Manero are needed for these solutions, and we're just now getting there, right? We're just now making Manero flexible enough to support these solutions. And I think that the community, I'm sure developers and researchers and community members and miners and whoever else might have a stake in these decisions will, in these solutions, will come together and they'll argue their position for why they prefer that Monero developers pursue a certain technology or certain technologies over others. And I think that'll come down to technical limitations. But I think ultimately we shouldn't.
Hold on one second.
Well, it looks like I have the floor here. Any questions you want to throw in the comments? I'm happy to answer them. I'm not sure how much Currently 2 seconds. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Had a surprise visitor.
No worries.
Sorry to cut you off there. Just good. Go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah, there was one time I was doing an interview, and some maintenance person from my apartment came in and was like knocking at the door. I'm like, just come in and replace it.
It's a low budget production over here. But what'd you think of Aaron's article, which is basically everything we just talked about? But what was your overall feeling of that? He's been writing about the privacy coins in general. And then he just recently wrote about Monero. He's basically saying why Monero is hard to beat, but also hard to scale. Do you think it was kind of a fair assessment? Because I don't think there was even any mention in that article about the Lightning Network all these second layer options for Monero.
Yeah, so before he wrote that article, so right after he wrote the Dash article, I reached out to him and said, like, here's some more information that you can link in your Dash article. And if you are writing one on Monero and Zcash, which I assume you are, any other privacy technology and coins, I would be happy to be a resource you can use to answer some of these questions. So last week, or earlier this week, we scheduled a call and we spent like an hour and a half talking about Monero and Zcash. And he mentioned some of the concerns with Monero's larger transactions, and I pointed out that bulletproof proofs were available and we're moving to them next month. Also that that Manero can be pruned. You can remove some of the unnecessary transaction data, and tests are bringing it down to about a third of the current blockchain size right now, with additional potential. And we sort of came back. I think this is generally just a disagreement of opinion, where, I mean, from my perspective and from the perspective of most people in the Monero subreddit that are advocates of Monero, we feel that like given every current on-chain blockchain solution, none of these are scalable, right? Like none of these are perfect. They're not be able to go to a wide level of implementation. So trying to make them, or putting all of your eggs in the basket of trying to make it efficient is futile, because it never will be. Or at least from the technology available at the moment, it never will be. So that means that Bitcoin and Monero and all of these other projects need to use second layer solutions, right? And from my perspective and the perspective of most Monero advocates, we say that it's better to take an efficiency trade-off on the blockchain, since it provides better protection on these sidechain layers. And people who prioritize things like efficiency are going to use these sidechain layers anyway. And you can use a sidechain layer without too much concern. Like, you have to do settling and stuff for Lightning, of course, but without a significant amount of concern for on-chain, right? As long as it's efficient enough, you don't care as much. So we sort of come around this from two different thought processes, right? Where Aaron and most other Bitcoin proponents generally, not trying to speak for him and his beliefs, but generally Bitcoin proponents say that we want to keep the chain itself as lean as possible, which generally is a very good recommendation. And if people want additional efficiency or privacy beyond the chain can provide, that's what these off-chain solutions are for, or sidechain solutions. Mm-hmm. With Monero, we actually generally take a pretty similar approach, where we want the blockchain to be lean because it's important to get as much stuff off there as possible.
But we don't want to sacrifice.
Yeah, but we want to have the guarantees of privacy that we're familiar with. We want to hide transaction amounts. We want to reduce the metadata as people are interfacing with these Lightning Network systems, kind of what we've spent most of today talking about. Mm-hmm. So those aspects are very important to Monero enthusiasts, to Monero advocates. We think that is generally a better solution to start with the privacy. You should still make the chain as efficient as possible, of course, but it's okay if you make a trade-off for the sake of privacy, and because you can make that up on a side layer solution better than you can make. Sorry, just as simple to make this a little bit more clear. You can make up efficiency on a side layer solution far more effectively than you can make up privacy on a second layer solution. So
yeah, I think it's kind of analogous to if you told Bitcoin, because I think these really we're really looking at it in the same way, and they kind of go through this, weird logic where fungibility no longer matters. But I mean, censorship resistance obviously matters to them, right? That nobody in the Bitcoin core community would say, "Oh, let's do censorship resistance on the second layer," right? I don't think that would never make sense. But yet they don't put fungibility into that category as being required for censorship resistance.
Right. And yeah. I mean, obviously, from my perspective, I think privacy is important for security and censorship resistance, right? I acknowledge there are different opinions. I acknowledge that some people think that sidechain solutions will provide a good enough solution or something that they feel comfortable with. And so I think that's an important acknowledgement to make. It's not something I agree with, but that's the perspective they're generally coming from.
And I think it's just they don't have the ability of adding it to the Bitcoin blockchain at this point. I just don't see that happening. So at this point, there's no reason for them. They've settled on the fact that it will have to be on the second layer. I don't see them adding confidential transactions without the community completely being split.
I generally agree with you. Yes.
So he also brought up some interesting points, though, too. I don't know if you agreed with these. He was talking about a scenario where if essentially Monero users were kind of opting out of the privacy, and that the protection that ring signatures gives us would eventually break down if enough people opt out. But that doesn't seem like a realistic scenario. I guess he was saying because everybody's going through these exchanges. You get what I'm saying? Did you?
Yeah,
pick up on that point? That seemed like a far-fetched concern.
Yeah, so this is luckily this concern still impacts like the legitimacy of the outputs on the Manero blockchain, or the in a similar way that any other attack would. So it affects it similarly to a chain split attack. It affects it similarly to a zero decoy attack, which are no longer possible. But the concern generally is that if a very large number of Manero outputs were revealed to large exchanges or even the public, that it could be detrimental to privacy. It could start to have these chain reaction effects on these ring signatures. So, for instance, suppose that you had, as a regulatory measure, all the major Monero exchanges required to post their view key publicly for everyone, which is a very unrealistic scenario, but suppose that might be what happens. The concern is that you could use this data in conjunction with pool mining data and every other view keys that are available in order to have some insight over a lot of outputs on the Monero blockchain. That's the concern.
Yeah.
Is it realistic? Probably not. Do ring signatures provide built-in protection against these scenarios? Yes, they do, just like they provide built-in protection against all the other attacks I mentioned, including these chain split attacks. So, yeah, I mean, it's a concern, and if we have any, I think we generally feel comfortable with the buffer, again, that the ring signatures we have right now provide in the network current scenario. And I think that in order to address this problem, we might increase the buffer, whatever it might be. But we've been looking as an area of research, starting with these public mining pools that have a lot of public-facing data.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of started there to determine, okay, what proportion of network transactions and outputs are public, and wonder what scenarios should we be concerned and what they can do. And we've come up with some pretty novel techniques that don't even cost anything else. They're just a different way of doing things that would help the network and help preserve these outputs. So we definitely have the opportunity for many solutions to mitigate this problem. I think these concerns are acknowledged in Manero, like MRL 1 and MRL 4, I believe, at least one of those, where like if everyone makes their data public, well, then you don't have a private pool to hide it anymore, right? So that's generally what the argument boils down to, is that if everything's public, nothing's private. Well, yes, you're right. So we need to encourage the private pool to stay private. And
from the standpoint of exchanges too, I mean, I think that just kind of continues to push us towards decentralized exchanges, right?
Oh, absolutely. One of the best ways to ensure this doesn't happen is to encourage decentralized exchange use.
That at this point seems inevitable to me. I don't see why we won't be in a world where decentralized exchanges will be, the new centralized exchange.
I mean, centralized exchanges are efficient and provide a lot of conveniences, so there's value there.
But do you think we're moving in that direction in crypto in general? I mean, you have all this KYC, AML. I mean, it's becoming difficult. It's like companies like Shapeshift now are starting to, have to implement that. I think it's really starting to hit home with people.
I think generally, the people using exchanges are typically those that are trading cryptocurrency, that are there to make a profit, and so their primary motive is to make a profit. So they want a convenient way to make profit. They want a convenient way to handle other people, to easily handle their funds. And I think centralized exchanges will most likely meet their needs better. But I still think that nevertheless, there's a large enough group of people that are interested in these priorities of security and privacy that decentralized exchanges will continue to make sense, and will act as a hedge, especially in adversarial environments where governments might be trying to restrict the use of exchanges, or in the case of Monero, where you really care about your privacy and do not want to use a KYC AML exchange, that these decentralized exchanges provide a lot of value. So I think as these systems continue to get better, sort of narrow the efficiency gap, make it more convenient, they'll continue to get better. But in a way, it's a sort of chicken and egg scenario where people go generally where the volume is, and if there's no volume, people won't go there. So you need BISC has, which is one decentralized exchange that supports Manero, has really been trying to encourage volume. And
have you used them?
Yeah, I mean, I have it on my computer right
now. How's it work? I mean, is it somewhat user friendly? Is it something? How does it?
I have a favorable view of it. It's definitely not easier than using, or more convenient than using most centralized exchanges, but it's nice knowing that there's fewer trust requirements, and like I said, I think there's generally value there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I just see that getting bigger and bigger, and I think it has, right? The stats, it seems like it's growing, right, BISC?
Yes, it generally has, and I think the interest in decentralized exchanges has grown too. There are more projects involved, their own novel implementation. Most of them don't make sense, but just the mere large number of them shows that there's at least interest. Like there's a market for it, right? And I don't think they've grown as quickly as centralized exchanges, especially during peak hype of 2017. But they nevertheless have still seen more use over time generally.
Did you say you had mentioned in the chat that you had something to maybe say about ring signatures from the Monero Research Lab, some kind of new insight? That was
yeah. So generally, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. This is where
okay.
Brandon. I'm speaking with Brandon later, where he's showing me a diagram, so I make sure I understand it a little bit more thoroughly. But the Monero Research Lab team has devised better mechanisms for assessing different scenarios where we can start to find where any incremental increase in ring size is negligible, where like the difference between 100 and 101 is essentially nothing, to the point where you don't need to care about ever getting to those numbers, as an example. And with the most recent tests they've been doing, they're looking at certain, this is where I need to more thoroughly understand what these scenarios are, but they're looking at some of these specific scenarios where, okay, what situation does a higher ring size not really contribute anything more? And for the specific test they were doing, which wasn't a strong heuristic test, so this is generally, from my understanding, an underestimate, but from a probable test, that 25 is about the level where it doesn't really, any increases don't really matter. And again, I still want to learn more about this, but it luckily gives us a number, and 25 is generally within reach for what we have technologically available. So it's generally a positive sign for using ring signatures, is that, under any of these adversarial conditions combined, realistically, it doesn't matter beyond 25. So that's really good to know. It means that so far with the primitive models that have been identified, that we're within striking distance, which is generally good. We might not need ridiculous ring sizes for it to reasonably matter.
So do you then see that being as kind of a few hard forks away?
It's hard to say. MRL still supports our current plan to go to 11 next month, and I would need to know more information before I make any recommendation about a specific number.
Sure.
But it's good to know. I mean, this is another piece of evidence that is reinforcing these sort of numbers making sense. I believe 2 months ago on a previous Monero coffee chat, Brandon gave out the number of 22 as an example, and I think that's pretty similar to 25. So it's more and more evidence that's sort of getting us closer and closer to what number is optimal for what privacy guarantees are necessary or desired, and how we can make sure that the technology can cope with the efficiency trade-off, and make sure that we optimize it as much as possible.
Very nice. That sounds encouraging. Because I mean, the idea, so then once we reach that number, it's like that's it for ring signatures in terms of what we can do.
Exactly, and that's what he mentioned. He's like, do you know how tempting it is for me, like the amount of work that we put together on all of this ring signature analysis, to say that, oh, well, we could just bump it to 25 and never have to worry about it again.
Let's just do it. Let's do it.
And again, I want to reiterate that scenario is not exactly what it is yet. We're not set on these heuristics, right? We don't necessarily feel comfortable with them yet. But if we were feeling more comfortable about these assumptions and knew a certain number was what we needed, the temptation to just jump to it and not have to worry about this ever again is extremely tempting.
So who essentially is going to be making that decision? How would you describe that process?
So things like ring signatures are typically a developer-focused and especially research-focused decision.
It's kind of a debate between the researchers and the developers, or?
I mean, generally, yes. So those sort of deliberations will mostly occur between the researchers and developers, similar to what we had mostly with the fixed ring size decision, where Manero has decided, based off feedback from especially researcher developers and the wider community, to move to a fixed, you have to use a ring size of 11 next month. You can't choose like 12 if you wanted to choose 12, for various reasons that were debated. And
Does
we'll
anybody
going
anybody else offer kind of input into that? Like, how about like the wallet developers or the exchanges? Are they kind of influencing those decisions as well?
So not especially strongly, but if they had an opinion, we would of course listen to it. I mean, generally exchanges and pools probably want the lowest ring size possible for the sake of saving fees.
Right.
But so you need to hear their perspective, but make sure you don't just take it as is. But their perspective is important to make sure you're not just choosing an overkill ring size, so to speak, that would cause more harm to the network than good. It's important to have those perspectives in mind. But ultimately, these things like the ring size are ultimately a mostly research decision to determine under what situations these matter. And the work put in by researchers is generally much higher valued because they have all the hard numbers behind it. And you are, of course, welcome to jump in and present your own hard numbers. I mean, that's really what I've done. I'm not even done with my undergrad yet, right? So I don't really come from this strong academic background, but like I made the case for ring size 7 in the spring. So if you can make the case for like a research case for any specific point, by all means do it. So it's important to keep those in mind, but they're generally a mostly research decision because you need to ultimately make that trade-off. And people are, of course, welcome to present the evidence they have in helping determine that trade-off. But and it's possible not everyone will agree with everything, but Monero will move with people that like if the vast majority of people agree in a certain way, we'll typically prioritize that. We'll prioritize that perspective, similar to what we did with Monero's previous proof of work algorithm change, where not everyone agreed. I'm sure some people disagreed somewhere, but generally people agreed to change the algorithm, and we went forward with it. And we'll have a similar decision-making process with ring size and stuff too.
How do you think Monero's kind of maintained its ability to stay as a cohesive community, and as opposed to like Bitcoin, where there's a lot more contention? You think it's just a matter of our age, and we're a little younger, and we haven't gone through those growing pains yet, or do you think there's also kind of something fundamentally different about the community?
It's a combination of things. I think mostly it's that the community's smaller and has less stakeholders that are very vocal. So I think that, it helps to be able to be a little bit more lean from that perspective. Also, I think, though, we have very well-defined values of privacy, of fungibility, of security, of decentralization. So making these changes, which might be large protocol changes, such as the addition of ring CT, is generally less controversial because when people get involved in Monero, they understand that privacy is an important part of its identity, right? It's important for us to provide a high level of privacy, and so we can make these decisions easier when people in the community are generally for privacy, if we're on the same page there. So I think that over time, there will be more conflict if Manero continues to grow larger. You'll have people with a large number of resources that try and push agendas in different ways, and it's something the community will have to deal with. That's a main function of the Monero community work group, is to provide a platform for people to have these debates, essentially, and get their point across and provide updates on what they've been doing. So we have a group of volunteers that have essentially made it our goal to try and get the community functioning as well as possible, right? But I can't say for sure that there will be no conflict or anything.
Right.
We just have to. We have a team in place that is there to address these situations, and we are hoping that it'll work. And I don't know what else we can really say for a relatively decentralized system. It's just that we're putting our best foot forward, and at least we can say we've done that.
I think skepticism, the fact that we kind of promote skepticism in the community has got, really attributed to that. So nobody's fearful of coming onto Reddit or wherever and stating their controversial opinion, and everybody's like surprisingly open to it. And in fact, if you go the opposite direction and you act as more of like a fanboy for things, you're kind of like that's kind of frowned upon more so than the skepticism, which I think is kind of helps create that cohesion among the community, because everybody's kind of taking more of a scientific approach, saying, well, we don't really know, we're all trying to figure this out together. Let's kind of be open to all options and ideas and look at it from like a scientific perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And the best way we can continue to make sure that happens is education, right? You're going to have new users that show up that don't know much. I was a new user that showed up and didn't know anything. Mm-hmm. And by some mechanism that I don't understand, I decided to learn about it despite it being difficult. I don't know why, what my motivation was really. And you need to make sure that people can continue to learn more, are immersed in the general values that Monero has had over time, understand the history, and hopefully teach them how to use their inspiration for good, I guess. People have different opinions. People probably hate the way that Manero has done some things in the past. And
sure.
We'll continue to address those on the Skepticism Sundays. And because we know that we're not always going to make perfect decisions, or there are going to be mistakes that happen. And I think accepting that reality is going a long way itself, making sure that we're on the best foot forward there.
So you want to wrap it before we wrap it up? I just wanted to, I guess, talk about your latest funding request, and then funding requests in general. How you've done them a few times. How's that worked out? What's the process?
Okay, yeah. So Monero uses a crowdfunding approach to raise money for projects. When I was traveling around Europe last year and giving talks about Monero specifically, it was expensive to travel around. And the community helped through 3 proposals that I created to reimburse the travel expenses. So I wasn't making money on this process. For the first proposal, when I took the money out or converted back to dollars from Manero, they were worth more than the initial proposal was. So I deducted those costs from the next proposal, and so on and so forth. So if you have an idea for something that's Monero related, you can pitch ideas on this form funding system proposal. You can address it or introduce it to the community on Reddit during the Monero community meetings, which is supposed to be going on right now. And right when we wrap it up, I'm going to jump right into that meeting.
Okay.
And discuss those situations. And my most recent one was to cover some of the costs to travel to Seattle for a blockchain conference there and give a talk about Monero. So that will be next month. It's on a Tuesday, so it's a little awkward for me to get to, but I found a way to make it work. And the conference is covering the flight costs, but I've asked the community to reimburse the hotel and basic transit costs because it's unfortunately not directly accessible from the airport. And I'm going to another one, which I don't need another conference next month at North Dakota State University. They are covering the costs, so I don't need the community support there, luckily. That will be on the 27th of next month. So those will be the 2 speaking engagements I have coming up. I obviously encourage everyone to just go out there and sign up. The worst thing someone can say is no. Give yourself a fake tie. I'm kidding, but just say you've been involved. Be truthful about the involvement you've had. And if you want to get more involved, speak to people, make sure to let me know. I'm Samsung Galaxy Player on Reddit. Message me and say, hey, I would like a copy of your slides. I want to give a talk. I'd be more than happy to share that with you.
Great. Do you see the funding system staying this way, or do you think it could be improved? Do you think it's kind of a necessary component to this open source, the open source nature of Monero? Because I mean, you look at other projects like Dash and the way they're funding their development with essentially a percentage of the block reward going towards funding, or things like Zcash that have the Z Corp. What do you think of our system versus theirs, and kind of the pros, cons, and if it's working?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, there are pros and cons to both sets of models. I think that the form funding system that we use is a good fit for Monero. I think that it reinforces our community values of not wanting to have these structured companies or even foundations around supporting the project. So I think it is a good fit for Monero. I think that there are many advantages that we're missing out on, unfortunately. There's a lot of value from the guarantee to know you'll have money from a block reward, for instance. But there's also a lot of cons that the miners don't like that. The community would never have it. So we need to weigh those pros and cons. And the form funding system itself can use improvements to update to the latest and greatest mechanisms of the Manero protocol. It's not user-friendly, and at the moment is sometimes riddled with spam, but we've been in a process of eventually migrating for a few months now, and hopefully we're able to actually do that. And but despite all the shortfalls, I think it's generally a good strength. It really has pulled through and paying for necessary contributions to the Manero ecosystem, and I think it's here to stay in one form or another to continue to provide a mechanism for people to raise money. Of course, people don't they can use GoFundMe or whatever if they want to, but this is just a really accessible tool that has been very successful in the past. And I hope it will continue to improve to make that process even easier. But even as is, without receiving an update for 2 years or more, it still functioned pretty well.
It's like Craigslist.
Yes, it's like Craigslist. It's riddled with spam, and it's a UI out of 2,000, but it works.
But it gets the job done. Yep. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on. I hope we can chat again in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doug. I really enjoyed coming on. I'm so happy that you're doing these Monero talks. It was a gap that was sort of left in the Monero ecosystem, so I'm really happy that you're able to be out here speaking with a lot of the contributors. And I encourage you to continue being active. Message me anytime. Pop by the Monero community IRC channel, and we all love to see you there too.
Will do. We'll keep it going.
All right. Thanks so much again.
Thanks,
take
man.
care.
Have a good day.
You too.